Greetings, Pastor John Lane here again. This is lecture 4 in Free Methodist History and Polity, and this is the history part. I entitled this A Brief History of the Movement, but this may take a bit of time for us to walk through. I want to thank my good friend Superintendent Mark Adams for these slides. I've added a few other things, but he has just been incredibly helpful for these slides as we look at the brief history of the Free Methodist movement and where we are. So I want to show you this video, if it'll work, just showing you kind of the spread of Christianity throughout time. And you'll kind of see where it has spread from the very beginning. So that's kind of a big overview of Christianity throughout time, but throughout the last 2,000 years. So there's kind of an idea that every 500 years there's something significant that happens in the church. There's a couple different ways to look at church history. Here's two maps that we're going to look at. So beginning at Pentecost, when the Spirit was poured out upon the church and persecution began, between then and around 500 AD, as Christianity grew, there came a point when the 5 or 7 ecumenical councils gathered in order to recognize which books of the Bible are authoritative to write the Apostles' Creed. So that was anywhere from 300 to 500. And then in 1054, the next 500 years period, is when the East and the West split. It's called the Great Schism. We are a part of the Western Church, and so we tend to think as Western Christians. The Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox, Greek, Russian, and Eastern Orthodox is completely different for many of us, just in how they think about icons or about that the ultimate end of humanity is to meld into the Lord. And so the Eastern Orthodox Church is incredibly valuable in helping us understand our walk with the Lord. But we just tend towards the Western side. Since that great split, the divide was over where the center of the church would be, whether it be Istanbul, Constantinople, or if it would be in Rome. And the Eastern Orthodox believed it should be in Constantinople or Istanbul, and the Western Church believed it should be in Rome. And so there was a split and divide between the church patriarchs in the East and the Roman Catholic popes. And so the Great Divide happened. The next 500-year period was when Martin Luther came around and nailed his thesis on the Wittenberg door and stood up against papal oppression and the selling of indulgences, which were forms of forgiveness, and really rediscovered salvation by grace through faith. We are connected with that, though we, in connection with the Methodist Church, which is in connection with the Anglican Church or the Church of England, we really come out of the divide between the Church of England and the Catholic Church, which was over the king's desire to marry, and the Pope said no. And so we're a part of that Protestant corner of the church. Protestant meaning protesting, and so we are protesting the oppression that was at that period, but as well a definition of what it means to be saved by grace through faith. And you'll recognize that we actually are at another 500-year period at this point here in 2024, and some people are asking the question, what is it that is bringing the change, or what change is happening now? And one of my favorite theologians, she liked to say before she passed that the church is having a garage sale at this point, but we just don't know what we're selling. So you'll see the kind of divide in the Protestant church in 1517 AD, the Lutheran side with Martin Luther, out of which came the Free Evangelical Covenant, the Free Presbyterian churches, and you'll see there, and the Anabaptist movement. Then there were the Reformed churches, the Presbyterian Church, the Congregational Church, out of which came Puritan movement, which many then Baptist churches came out of that. We are in the Anglican Church of England end of the Protestant Reformation, out of which came the Episcopal Church, which is the Church of England in the United States, the Methodist Church, and here you'll see we are on that wing, Free Methodist, Bible Methodist, Calvin Methodist, United Methodist, then the Wesleyan Church, the Holiness churches, the Nazarene churches. So we're part of this whole holiness movement that came out of the Anglican Church, especially when it formed out of Methodism and jumped the ocean into the United States. You'll notice the Pentecostal charismatic churches really are our grandchildren, that they come right out of the Wesley Arminian holiness. And so that's just a big overview of the church. But our story really begins in with John Wesley in England. John and Charles Wesley were Anglican priests that were born in the 1700s, and were born to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Now, Samuel was an Anglican pastor. Susanna and Samuel had 19 children. 10 of them survived. Politics in the Wesley family between Samuel and Susanna was a little bit heated. Susanna was a separatist nonconformist. The arguments of the time as to whether or not the king was the right king, or the king should be either Catholic or the king should be Church of England. And so there was this ongoing debate inside of the Wesley home. You'll notice with the 10 children surviving, 9 children died. There's stories told about Susanna, who had just had deep impact in John and Charles Wesley's life, that the house was not that big, and so when she would be doing her devotions or prayer time, she would take her apron and she'd put it over top of her head, and that was the sign really for John and Charles and the family to leave Susanna alone. There's a story told about Susanna, just to show the impact. Samuel, being a pastor, the Anglican priest, he often struggled to know how to handle money, and so he spent a little bit of time in debtor's jail. And he went on a trip at one point, and they took another Anglican pastor, priest, and put him in the parish where Samuel was serving. And a lot of people didn't like that priest. He just wasn't necessarily that interesting. So Susanna started her own Bible study, her own Sunday school class, and it grew. I mean, 5, 10, 15, 20, it just kept growing, and dozens and dozens of people that would wait outside of her home as she was sharing from the scriptures, to the point where the priest began to complain, and so he wrote Samuel, and Samuel then wrote this kind of infamous letter to Susanna telling her to stop the Bible study. And Susanna replied back to him in an infamous letter. She said, "If you have heard from the Lord that I'm supposed to stop, since you are my husband, I will obey you. But if you have not heard from the Lord, I will still obey you, but you will be answerable to God himself for stopping this Bible study." And Samuel said, you can keep the Bible study going. But Susanna was deeply influential in John and Charles' life. This is their home, and early on in John Wesley's life, there was a fire, and one of the townspeople came in and pulled John Wesley out of the house with flames licking around him. And for the rest of his life, he viewed himself as a brand that was plucked from the fire. In other words, there's a purpose for my life, and I've been pulled from death by the Lord. And so he always had a sense that God was going to use him. John and Charles were good students, educated at Oxford University. They both had, kind of intentions to go into as Anglican priests, to be good Church of England pastors. While they were there at Oxford, they formed a holy club with some other friends that studied the scripture, met together. In fact, what they did in gathering together and fasting on Thursdays and studying the scriptures and being really intentional, it was so methodical that other students called them the Methodists, and that's where the name came from, that they were so methodical in all of their intentional, Bible study and prayer time and all that they're just Methodist. John and Charles are sent across the ocean into the United States as missionaries to Georgia, and depending upon who you talk to, that either went okay or didn't go well at all. It wasn't really a great success, but they were sent to the colonies here in the United States, whereas British missionaries to America, pastoring even to the governor, and missionaries to Native Americans. It didn't necessarily go well, but they tried. Story is told about John Wesley. He was interested in a woman and tried to court her while he was here, and she didn't want to date him, and so he refused this woman and her new boyfriend, communion. They came to communion. He said, "No, I'm not going to serve you communion." And so he had some things to work through. You can actually go visit in Georgia, just out south of Savannah, this area where John and Charles were ministers. He was in one of the local pubs trying to minister to people, and someone grabbed a fork and chased him out and tried to stab him. And so it just didn't necessarily go well. So he heads back to England, and on the way there, he's sailing in the ocean, and a storm came up. And there were a group of Christians, Moravian Christians they were called, from Count Zinzendorf, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about them later. Moravian Christians who were kind of connected with the Protestant Reformation and Lutheranism, but they tended to be more spirit-led, spirit-filled, more charismatic. And in the middle of the storm, John Wesley's he's fearing for his life. He thinks he's going to die. And the Moravians are over there praising the Lord, and they're praying. And John Wesley just felt like, what's wrong with me that I'm terrified of dying, and my Moravian friends are ready to go. On the way back, this is what John thought. I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me? So just a lot of deep questions and doubts about his walk with the Lord. Was it real? Was it academic? Yeah. So he returns to England, and his encounters with Moravians on the ship caused him to be connected with them back in England. They trace their roots back to John Huss and the Czech reformers, to Count Zinzendorf as the main theologian. And in England, then Peter Bowler, who was their lead representative. And Peter Bowler and John Wesley formed the Fetter Lane Religious Society later. That is a point when John Wesley actually becomes even more filled with the Spirit. But the Moravians had a deep impact on John Wesley's life. So much so that Bowler said to John at one point, because John was struggling to know whether he had faith, the faith of a child, the faith of a servant, the faith of a son. And Bowler told him to preach faith till you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach faith. So he ends up back in England. He's not doing real great. He's struggling to know what he should do next. He's wondering whether or not he's just a failure, and then he's even wrestling with his walk with the Lord and what it is he believes. So he was invited to a Moravian gathering, and at the Moravian gathering, the introduction to Martin Luther's commentary on Romans was being read. Not even the commentary itself, like the introduction was being read. And in there, Luther is explaining about salvation by grace through faith. And while Wesley is listening, and he says he didn't even really want to go to this gathering, but he shows up. He says this: while they were describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. This was in 1738, and it really transformed John Wesley. Charles Wesley had a similar experience, that he opened up his heart to salvation by grace through faith. You know, you don't have to go all the way to Georgia in the United States in order to save yourself, that the Lord's gift of free salvation can be grabbed a hold of. And so at this point, Wesleyan movement really begins. He moves from this Aldersgate experience into preaching in Bristol. George Whitefield, who is preaching to coal miners, invites John Wesley to come and preach with him. He forms these coal miners and others into societies and class meetings, and even opens up a school there in Bristol, forming a discipleship system that we will talk about. You often will hear us talking about of the band, a small group of people gathered together, the class, the larger group, maybe 12 to 20, and then the society, the whole church. And in order to be a part of the class, you had to go to a band, and in order to go to the class, you had to have a ticket that you had shown up to the band and confessed your sins and been a regular attender, and you could actually be kicked out of these groups. Because you got to remember that the Methodist system, the whole Methodist movement, it began as a reform movement within the Anglican Church. John Wesley was an Anglican priest the rest of his whole life. In fact, he encouraged people to be a part of the Methodist system and yet still be a part of the Anglican Church. And so it was never really intended to be a separate church. When it came here to the United States, that was a little bit different because of the Revolutionary War. So in America, the War of Independence was beginning, and in Methodists that had come to the United States found that there weren't any really gatherings for them. And so they wrote back to John Wesley, could you send some people to become pastors here in the United States? And so he takes Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, and he ordains them and sends them to the United States in order to meet the needs of the new colonies. You can imagine the political struggle between, the colonies at the time in England, and it's interesting, from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, all throughout that time, not only did the church survive, it thrived and just continued to grow. Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, I cannot say enough about them. They are just powerful men. They rode horseback thousands of miles in order to spread Christianity all throughout the United States. At one point, the Methodist Episcopal Church had planted a church in every zip code in the United States. It was just, the Lord just did an amazing work through these men and through other circuit riders. Thomas Coke and Asbury, when they landed here in the United States, they took on the name Bishop, which John Wesley didn't particularly like. He felt they should just be called general superintendents, or, they're taking on too many titles. But Coke and Asbury said, John, we need the authority here in the United States to be recognized as bishops so that we can ordain. We can't just wait for you to come back over the ocean or others in order to ordain. So, they took on the title bishop here as Methodism spread here in the United States. And that's in the Christmas conference when the Methodist Episcopal Church was organized in Baltimore, and they were entitled as bishops. John Wesley died on March 2nd, 1792, and his last words were, "Best of all, God is with us." Some of his famous last words. Just a few things about Wesley. It's interesting. You can read these. In a single year, he walked 1,000 miles. He was educated and taught at Oxford, founded a school for orphan boys. He founded free medical clinics, the first of its time at the time. This is Mark Adams. I wanted to show you next to John Wesley, who was not very tall. And Mark's not a giant either, but, in comparison to John Wesley, he just, look how small John Wesley was. Published 233 original works. He just thought about a lot of different things besides theology, different treatises, and a volume history on England. This is a picture of John Wesley's prayer room, his bench where he did his devotions and prayer time. There's a story told, whether it's true or not. It has some deep roots and impact. Story told that there was a busload of college students that were visiting John Wesley's home there in London, visiting this particular place where John Wesley would kneel here on this bench and pray. And when they went to go back on the bus, they noticed they were missing one college student. And so the teacher goes back in, and there's a student kneeling here at this bench, praying that the Lord would do it again in America, what he did in England, and the rescuing of England through John Wesley. And the teacher said, "Come on, Billy Graham, you need to leave." And so Billy had been praying here for the Lord to really do a new work. Whether it's true or not, it's a powerful story, and this is a very powerful place. One of the things that John Wesley was known for is preaching outdoors. Now, you need to know that from the very beginning, he hated it. He hated preaching outdoors. He wrote in his journal about not liking preaching outdoor. He was a high churchman in many ways, a good Anglican, and it just felt odd to him to preach outside. George Whitefield had said, "Hey, come on over to Bristol and preach, because I'm ministering to these coal miners." And at the end of John Wesley's life, he wrote in his journal, "I hate field preaching." Like, he never changed, but he did it his whole life. And even as the churches became closed for John Wesley to preach in their pulpits, because many pastors would just shut it down because they saw him as a little too fanatical, the ministry continued among common people who didn't have access necessarily to the Church of England churches. So where you see this is this cross here. This is Hanham Mount in Bristol, where John Wesley would preach. George Whitefield had called him over. And I just imagine the coal miners, tears running down their face as they're hearing the gospel. And then I imagine how many wives and family members had been praying for these coal miners, because it's a terribly dangerous job, and they could, they're dirty all the time. But how many of them had been praying? Their wives had been praying that the Lord would reach them. And so here comes John Wesley, who hates field preaching, and yet they get to hear him and hear the good news of Jesus for them. And this really changed John Wesley's perspective about ministry to broken people. By the way, George Whitefield, who was powerful help in the Second Great Awakening, in the Great Awakenings here in the United States as well, came over, in England and then to the United States. George Whitefield's legacy is a little bit tainted because when he arrived here in the United States, he was an abolitionist against slavery, and then he was given a plantation. I think it was through his wife's family, if I'm not mistaken, but he inherited it, and he changed his mind, not necessarily about slavery, but about the idea that it needed to happen right now, because he said, I can't run the plantation, I can't run this farm without slaves. So he went and he actually made an argument before the governor to not free slaves, and there's many that think Whitefield set back the abolitionist movement, and so it's a difficult thing just thinking about how people have with clay feet, and Christians can sometimes stop the work of the Lord that's happening because of our other things we're unwilling to face. And so anyway, but Wesley he got into field preaching because of George Whitefield. There's a bunch of different things Wesley did. You can read through these. He opposed slavery, his last letter being influential in British Parliament, abolishing slavery in the whole empire, except for us, because we had declared independence at the time. In fact, Wesley called the slavery, the transatlantic slave trade in the United States the worst form of sin he'd ever seen, right? That it's the darkest stain. And so he did a lot of other things. You can just kind of look. He followed the new work of Benjamin Franklin, and so just interesting thinking about all these people in their time and their space. He earned the equivalent of millions, but gave it away. Traveled over 250,000 miles on foot, preached 45,000 times. He's credited with the saving of England. The Lord did it through he and Charles and the Methodist movement. There's many people that believe that had it not been for the Methodist movement, England would have had a bloody revolution the same way that France did, and that there was a change of heart all across England that really kept it from happening. A few quotes from John Wesley: do all the good you can by all the means you can, and all the ways you can, and all the places you can, and all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever you can. You have nothing to do but save souls. Therefore spend and be spent in this work, and go not only to those that need you, but to those that need you most. It is not your business to preach so many times and to take care of this or that society, but to save as many souls as you can, to bring as many sinners as you possibly can to repentance. Give me 100 preachers who fear nothing but sin and desire nothing but God, and I care not whether they be clergymen or laymen. They alone will shake the gates of hell and set up the kingdom of heaven upon earth. It cannot be that the people should grow in grace unless they give themselves to reading. A reading people will always be a knowing people. Think and let think. But beware you be not swallowed up in books. An ounce of love is worth a pound of knowledge. John Wesley had a whole list of books that he required his pastors to read, even as they're traveling on horseback, and he told them, develop a love for reading or get out of the ministry. Having first gained all you can, this is about money, save all you can, and then give all you can. He also said the gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. It has to impact the community. And even cleanliness is next to godliness, he said. So you see how because of the Great Awakening, the number of denominations and people that came to know the Lord within the last couple hundred years just grew powerfully. And Methodists were a deep part of that awakening movement, going from 17% who claimed to be Christians or church adherents up to 34% in 1950. And we need it again. As you looked at our stats earlier, we need the Lord to do it again. Um, we already looked at some of the history of the church, but you kind of see as we came out of John Wesley's reform, we are deeply connected with many different kinds of Methodist and the holiness movement that were formed out of John Wesley's work. So then what about us? Well, we need to move from John Wesley, into the story of B.T. Roberts. And the Free Methodist story is that B.T. Roberts and Ellen Roberts and many other people, such as Kendall and others, pastors at the time in the 1800s, they had grown up in a social milieu where they knew the history of John Wesley, they knew the impact of Methodism, but they were living in a time that the church really wasn't living it out, and at a time of great stress between the North and the South over issues of slavery and many other issues. And it is in the midst of this, as you read in your book, I'm not going to go through all of the history of B.T. Roberts, because as a part of the class, you're to read the story of B.T. and Ellen Roberts. He writes this article called New School Methodism, that he compares how the Methodists that were around him, the pastors and the lay leaders at the time, compared to those of John Wesley, which made a really deep impact in the community at the time, because they didn't take it very well. It was deeply critical of the Methodist church at the time. Roberts is born in 1823. He's ordained in 1848, and the Free Methodist Church is founded in 1860. You can kind of see all that's going on during his life. It just really was a unique and challenging time here in the United States, and asking the question, where should the church be involved and what should it lead in? And B.T. Roberts felt, and Ellen felt, that the church should be right in the middle of questions about morality and reaching people for the Lord, particularly in the area of slavery. Roberts was a lawyer and an author and an activist and a pastor, and all of these kind of worked together in order to help be a spark that formed the Free Methodist Church. Roberts also was connected, and Ellen were connected with Phoebe Palmer. Phoebe Palmer was an evangelist at the time that had a deep impact in launching the holiness movement. Phoebe Palmer was a deep believer in a second work of grace, when God would enter into you through the Holy Spirit and cleanse your heart. Some people feel that Phoebe Palmer went overboard, and that B.T. Roberts was tempted to go overboard with her, to the idea that our hearts could be completely and utterly cleansed from sin. And he did often use that language, and Phoebe Palmer leaned that way. But you hear these words from B.T. Roberts about his time at a Phoebe Palmer evangelistic crusade. The Spirit fell upon me in an overwhelming degree. I received a power to labor such as I had never possessed before. This consecration has never been taken back. I have many times had to humble myself before the Lord for grieving His Spirit. I have been an unprofitable servant. It is by grace alone that I'm saved, yet the determination is fixed to obey the Lord and take the narrow way, come what will. So that's in 1850, and it's in the midst of all of that B.T. Roberts is meeting other people who are interested in growing deeper and closer to the Lord, and seeing what he is seeing in the Methodist Episcopal Church not living out what it should. So, like John Wesley Redfield, who was deeply connected with B.T. Roberts and had an impact. Time-serving preachers did not like John Wesley Redfield's converts. They had no relish, he wrote, for religious theatricals and church festivals. They were hard to manage. Hence, Dr. Redfield generally encountered, wherever he labored, fierce opposition from ecclesiastics. Ecclesiastics were people that just wanted to play church, but they didn't necessarily want the power. They didn't want the Spirit moving, and they referred to Roberts and Redfield as just fanatics. And so even as they're preaching, they're trying to bring change. Ellen and BT were abolitionist activists. They really did not understand how you could be a follower of Jesus and a slave owner, let alone, a slave owner or someone that advocates for the slave owners to keep slaves. And he wanted it done now. He wanted the change to happen now. And he brought pressure to the Methodist Episcopal Church because there were a couple of bishops that had inherited slaves. And so he wanted their bishop's titles removed. And he stood up for those in slavery. As you had read, he was brought to trial. He is kicked out of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Peking, New York, in an open camp under an apple tree, right after he and many others had been kicked out, including many lay people. If you remember from reading, there was a layman's convention that occurred around 1858 that gathered lay people together to try to turn around the Methodist Episcopal Church in Genesee Conference in New York. And so many of them were kicked out. So they gathered together after these trials in August of 1860, and they said, well, what should we do? We can't stop. The Lord has laid this on our hearts. And so we're going to keep preaching, and we're going to form this sect called Free Methodism. What should we call ourselves? Well, we like the term Methodist, and we need to stand up for freedom. And so the Free Methodist Church began here in August 23rd of 1860. It was founded on things such as sanctification and simplicity, an equal lay and clergy balance with no slavery. And at the beginning, there were 15 preachers and 45 lay people. And then in the early years, it was into the thousands that began to follow and enter into the Free Methodist Church. Right from the beginning, as we read in one of the first videos, our mission is twofold: to maintain the biblical standard of Christianity and preach the gospel to the poor. In the birthing of this movement, the Lord really did bless in the first, 40 years of the movement. Churches were planted. People became followers of Jesus. It really grew and exploded early on, so much so that we had the same number of people just a few years ago in the Free Methodist Church that we had in 1900. It just was an explosion of movement. 1,200 people at the beginning to 25,000 people just in a 20-year period, with global missions beginning and being a part of the Underground Railroad, the Earnest Christian movement, the early Earnest Christian magazine getting written, how women and African Americans and lay people were empowered in order to be a part, and then Roberts Wesleyan College was formed. So just this movement that happened right at the beginning. You will it's kind of important to see that there's a transition that happened between 1890 and 1950. When we formed in 1860 to about 1900, then the movement just kept growing and going and reaching people. And then we entered from the movement phase into what some call the sect phase, where we are starting to organize and there's not as much movement. And in 1950, or that period, is when denominations really started to make sure the rules are followed and make sure that they are maintaining the system, and really help plateau us off so that we're more worried about maintaining the system than about reaching new people. And now some people feel we're in a network phase. Like the networks that happen between denominations are even more important than the relationships in the denomination at times. And so we just don't know where it's going to go. But this whole networking seems to be truly important. And maybe up to 2 million people worldwide. We're at 1.5 million now. And a lot of the growth is happening outside the United States, but there's some amazing things happening here in the United States. I want to go through some crucial general conferences and some things that happen in different general conferences. And The General Conference is the organizing body of the whole church. Their annual conferences and local churches send delegates to. So in 1860, the Free Methodist Church was founded. It was the first General Conference. B.T. Roberts is ordained as bishop. In 1890, the General Conference refused to ordain women by just a few votes, and they restrained the Pentecost bands. E.P. Hart, who became a bishop as well with B.T. Roberts in between 1860 and 1890, who helped actually to found the Southern Michigan Conference. He was not in favor of ordaining women. He does make a statement in 1890 that I think he may have voted for it at that time, but up until then he had stood against it. But Roberts made such a good argument in 1890 to ordain women that maybe even E.P. Hart, who founded Spring Arbor and many churches in the area, that it changed his mind. But there was this tension right from the beginning as to whether we should ordain women. B.T. Roberts was very much believing we should. Ellen was. He was deeply influenced by Phoebe Palmer. He wrote Ordaining Women, the book that helped to convince many people. But it was only a few votes at that conference that it didn't happen. And it didn't happen then until later that we had fully ordained women. Women they were being evangelists and they were being deacons and they were doing things, but they weren't allowed to be an elder. So they couldn't serve communion or baptize, though I'm sure many of them did. The Pentecost bands were led by a man named Vivian Dake. Vivian Dake, B.T. Roberts had met him when he was younger, and just he even as a young man, I mean a boy even, he impressed Roberts. Dake became convinced that we need to keep sending out people to new areas, and so he would take 3 to 6 or so young people, 18 to 25, and he would send them to a new area. And he'd give them a tent, or he would tell them to go talk to a business person. And they'd go into a new town. They'd canvass the town. They would then have a revival series, and that would form new churches. Well, Vivian was also kind of a little bit of an entrepreneur, did his own thing. And so at the 1890 General Conference, they began saying, hey, you need to settle down a little, or, just tell us where you're going. Vivian Dake, by the way, was the pastor of the Spring Arbor Church and married a woman from Spring Arbor who ended up dying a year later. And his first Pentecost band was north of us in Parma, and then his second Pentecost band was in Hillsdale. But in 1890, they said, the denomination needs more control over what you're doing, which caused Vivian Dake and his followers to leave. Vivian Dake died close after the 1890 General Conference, but his followers left the denomination. They joined another group like in 1950. But many people think it was one of the restraining factors to our growth. Like, if we're going to turn down new work, God wouldn't necessarily honor it. In 1911, women were ordained as deacons and conference evangelists. In 1943, local churches are allowed to use an organ or piano. Now, that's going to surprise you, but in the early parts of the Free Methodist Church, we sang a cappella. The piano particularly was the instrument of the bar. The organ was the instrument of, the high society. And at the time when Roberts came out of the Methodist Episcopal Church, musicians were paid and the people didn't sing. So they couldn't be trusted to sing. So they just had these professional people sing. And so for a long time, you'll see 60 years, we didn't allow instruments in the church. There was also a ban on wedding rings and other superfluous adornment. In fact, the early Free Methodists would have been seen, a little bit more like we would see Pentecostal people today. In 1955, the musical instruments ban was overturned. Praise the Lord for us today, right? 1969, the SCOD, Study Commission on Doctrine, was formalized. Up until that time, there had been groups that would study doctrine, but we recognize we need a group who is really thinking about doctrine all of the time. And it kind of was based partly on the discussion of the emerging with the Wesleyan Church. And so we needed to do some deep dives to see if we're in alignment with them. Then finally in 1974, women are ordained as elders. And so it just, you think about from 1860, when Roberts was wanting to have women ordained, and many Free Methodists were, all the way to 1974. It took that long in order for women to be ordained as elders. They were doing other things. They were evangelists, they were preachers, they were deacons, but it wasn't until 74 that they were fully ordained as elders. In 1967, the board formed the Department of Christian Education. I bring that up because in the 50s to the 80s, that whole period was when all of us looked towards the denomination for our curriculum. And there's a change that has happened since then where we don't look to the denomination for our curriculum. But that was the denomination period when headquarters in many denominations was particularly strong and had a stronger say sometimes even than local church. In 1974, the bishops were ordered to live in Winona Lake, Indiana, which is where headquarters was. In 1985, a few years later, bishops then were requested to live in the areas they served. So sometimes we make decisions and have to overturn it later. In 89, the chair of the board was to be someone other than a bishop, as it is today. Eric Logan helps chair. He is the chair of the board of administration, along with Amy Colgan Clark, who's the assistant chair. In 1990, Canada became a separate general conference, and the Free Methodist Church USA moved to Indianapolis, which was an incredible move for some people because we moved from a small town into a large town, kind of in recognition of the cities, and that was an important move for many people, in many people's view. In 1995, there were major shifts that happened in membership understanding. In fact, 1995 was one of those really important general conferences. Up until that point, membership in the Free Methodist Church was seen as something that was bigger and higher than just salvation. And so you could be saved but not a member, attend and not a member, and it wasn't until you made certain promises about what you're going to wear and about whether you're going to dance and whether you're going to drink and those kind of things. And so we saw membership as something that we check off the boxes, and we're not going to do these things. We've achieved that point. In 95, we said, membership should be as close to salvation as possible so that we still want people to grow in grace and work out their salvation. But why should we wait for them to be members until they have their act together? This was a big struggle. I mean, some people think that we kind of lost an emphasis upon some things at that point, and others say, no, now membership is a tool to help people move along towards growth in Christ. In 2003, we redefined sanctification. Up until that point, there was entire sanctification was defined a particular way, and we'll talk about this definition in a minute. And a public trial happened. It was in Seattle, and it was over whether a pastor could be moved against his will, again that the bishop or the superintendent moved him. It was a really sad experience because afterward, even though the body found in favor of the pastor, 52 to 48, I think, the pastor just turned his credentials in and left the denomination. And so many people said, we shouldn't do that again, not like that. And so we changed the procedure. We still have trials if need be, but they don't happen in the same way. In 2015, the General Conference moved to Florida. There's a lot of kind of talk at the time as to whether we should still keep going to our schools such as Spring Arbor, Roberts Wesleyan. But from 2015 on, we've been at a hotel in Florida, which gives us a good deal and helps people be able to have some vacation down there. But it's not without its tension because it is a resort, and some people think, are we going against the plainness of which we were founded? In 2019, all of our bishops stepped down. They each came to the conclusion themselves that their time as serving as bishop was done. They had done a great job, by the way. I mean, this is Bishop David Kendall and Bishop David Roller and Bishop Matt Thomas. They had overseen a real period of peace and growth and in the denomination, and so they stepped down. And out of that came our first female bishop, who was elected, Bishop Linda Adams, and as well as the U.S. was declared a mission field. Bishop Keith Cowart was elected at the time, as well as Bishop Matt Whitehead was elected at the time. Kenny Martin, who's now one of our bishops, was 6 votes away from being bishop. In fact, he got over 50% of the vote in 2019. So some people think, man, if we had only noticed and said, let's move from 3 to 4 bishops, we had 4 people who had received over 50% of the vote. But that's in retrospect. In 2023 is when Kenny Martin was elected, our first African American bishop was elected. Bishop Kay Coldy was elected, and Bishop Keith Cowart was re-elected. After that, Linda Adams then became the Bishop of Canada. She went through that nominating process and got elected as Bishop of Canada. And we're just really grateful for Linda and Keith and Matt having written the Free Methodist Way, which is deeply important. As well, the big decision that happened in 2023, one of the big ones, we're still working out. But it's this, that we have empowered lay people to serve the sacraments when an elder tells them they can, or a superintendent tells them they can. And this may have been happening in various places, but the reason for this, the impetus for this, was church planting that was happening around the world that was going so fast that they couldn't wait for some elder to come, some pastor to come in order to serve communion and baptize, and so just empower the laity to serve communion and baptize. And we're still working out what this means, but we're one of the only Wesley Arminian groups that I know of that has said this, and so we're treading new water here, and I think it's going to be a useful tool in the founding of many churches and ministries. So the Free Methodist Way, which I encourage you to watch each of the videos, and it's required at least for this class to go online and find these videos. In 2020, when Bishops Linda and Keith and Matt were resting, the Lord used that time for them to ask the question and answer the question, what is historical? What's the spirit, the discipline, and the doctrine of the church? And what should we be focusing in on? And life-giving holiness, love-driven justice, Christ-compelled multiplication, cross-cultural collaboration, and God-given revelation is where they landed. And it has been a helpful pathway for us to focus in on where we're supposed to go. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these. You need to go and read this and then watch the videos, because that'll help you understand where we are going. I know for many people, having taken classes in the ordination track, you have to actually have a Free Methodist Way class. And so I don't want to repeat all of this. You can go and watch it and make sure you're taking the class. So we're upwards of 1.5 to close to 2 million members. There's 16 general conferences around the world, 47 annual conferences, 25 in the U.S. We're down to about 22 because of some mergers, and 37 mission districts around the world. And so from the beginning till now, the Lord has just blessed, and we are deeply thankful for the founding and the continuation of the Methodist Church, of the Free Methodist Church, our brothers in the Wesleyan Church and the Nazarene Church and the Salvation Army, and all that God continues to do. So that's the end of this lecture on a brief history of Free Methodism.